Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see so many of you. I wish we were in a room together, but this feels somewhat like old times and new times all at once. We're here to celebrate Anne Southworth's new book with Chicago University Press, that, as I hear, is about to get released and hot off the press and about to ship in the next couple of days. Big Money Unleashed, the campaign to deregulate election spending. This is a book that I feel like we've heard about in our circles. We've waited for this book to come out. It's so exciting to have the launch happen here. On behalf of the Center for Empirical Research on the Legal Profession, which I have the honor of co-running with Anne Southworth and Brian Garth, who are both here. I'm Sweta Balakrishnan. I am a professor here at UCI Law. And it gives me just such joy to have you all here to celebrate the launch of this book. We have 4 speakers here with us today. It is such an honor to introduce them. I will not take too much time giving their long biographies, but I do want to just say how very grateful I am that they're all here. It was the easiest task putting this together because all of you said yes before I even pressed send on the email, which says a lot about both Anne and the nature of this work. But really, the warmest welcome to John Bliss, who's an assistant professor at the University of Denver Strum School of Law, College of Law. Brian Garth, who's an old hand, and welcome back to UCI virtually, who's a distinguished professor of law, emeritus, and the SERP co-director of our center with Anne and I at UCI Law. Rick Hassan, again, welcome back, professor of law and political science and the director of Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA Law down the street, but we wish you were closer, Rick. We miss you. And Mary Ziegler, welcome again, Martin Luther King Jr., professor of law at the UC Davis School of Law. I feel like up the road, but not really. I feel like all of you are. I don't know why I think Davis is right here, but it feels like you're, trying to plan this event and been in conversation with you the last month just reminds me how much community there is for the celebration of this book. So really welcome to each of you. We wish there was a way in which SERP could have you here to do this, but I really feel honored that this is the community and the committee within which we're having this book unleashed, so to speak. You'll notice that a lot of the audience, your mics are muted on entry, so we're going to hold questions till right at the end. The order we're going on is, Mary, if you could start us off with comments, and then Rick, and then John and Brian right at the end, and we'll give you some time to do responses if that's helpful at all, or comments, or really just to bask in all of the joy that's going to be directed your way as you celebrate this book. And then we're going to be able to take questions if there is time, and hopefully there will be time for a few questions. Put your hand up or stick a question in the chat, and I'll keep the queue as best as I can. There are a couple of pages of Zoom room. And you'd think by now I'd know how to do this, but I still am nervous I'm going to let someone go. So please just keep me posted if you have a question. We'll add you to the queue. But mostly, Mary, on to you. Thank you so much for being here and to getting us started about thinking through this book.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to do the unfortunate thing where I ask Anne questions and then have to leave before she answers them. But Anne and I were working on kind of parallel books about campaign finance at the same time. So I was just delighted to finally have the chance to read the book. They're the final book. I've seen parts of the book because I've, for personal and professional reasons, have watched this book come into fruition and really am amazed by the final product, which is so compelling. I was particularly fascinated by the story about how both the First Amendment was transformed, or at least First Amendment doctrine was transformed, and how campaign finance law was too. And I thought too there was another story in the book, a kind of not just about an elite-driven revolution or revolution of elites, as Anne beautifully puts it, but also a story about maybe the transformation of the conservative legal movement too. Anne sort of tells a story that positions what we would conventionally think of as the conservative legal movement, the Federalist Society, and other kind of conservative legal elites, and some of the populist elements who come into her story at various points, including some of the anti-abortion activists I've studied, but not limited to them. There are other actors like the NRA and others who join these litigation campaigns and some legislative campaigns as well. So I was curious as I was reading about how we would draw the line between these populist forces and the Federalist Society, when at some points in the story, they're clearly outsiders, right? You have populist figures who are sort of becoming or seeking to enter a conservative legal movement. And at other points in time where it's not clear if those actors belong to both, right? So James Bobb, for example, is one of the kind of inaugural members of the Federalist Society's campaign finance practice. It's not called the Campaign Finance Practice Group, but what is in effect the Campaign Finance Practice Group? And so I wondered if this was a story about the conservative legal movement changing in fundamental ways, and if so, if money in politics or campaign finance and First Amendment law in particular were especially integral to bridging divides between populist and other factions in the conservative legal movement. Maybe because money was something that, money makes the world go round, money is something that conservatives could agree on because it facilitated power for them as individuals or for causes they advanced. Perhaps because it avoided some of the substantive topics on which members of this coalition disagreed at various points in time, including but not limited to issues like guns or abortion, which may not have commanded universal support from all of the members of the coalition and so convincingly describes. I was also really fascinated by how these First Amendment frames, which of course, as Anne details, were embraced by a variety of actors we would map onto the political left, like the American Civil Liberties Union, at various points like unions, became particularly resonant and identified with conservative politics and a broad swath of folks on the right. It became resonant, as Anne describes, to populists who were angry about what they saw as a biased and bloated federal government, to conservatives who were already experimenting with arguments based on the First Amendment in a variety of other contexts. Of course, there were instrumentalist claims at various points too. Early enough on in the struggle over McCain-Feingold, for example, interest groups on both sides of issues like abortion were advocating against campaign finance reform. So you have groups like Emily's List lobbying alongside the National Right to Life Committee. Those are, of course, entities that are usually diametrically opposed to one another. So I was curious to hear more from Anne about exactly when and why campaign finance opposition took on this kind of populist right-wing valence that the book describes, because it wasn't inevitable. And the transformation Anne describes is important and, of course, consequential in contemporary politics and law as well. There are, of course, any number of potential forces that could have fueled this change in the story. There's doctrine, there's coalition politics. There are, of course, forces beyond those documented in the book, like broader shifts in politics or culture or party politics that may have contributed to. My last thought is about the analogy to Brown and the NAACP, which Anne, I think, probes really fascinatingly. As Anne notes, a lot of scholarship on the limits of litigation as a tool for social change center the political left, not limited to, of course, struggles for racial justice, but certainly including them. The book illustrates, I think, the transformative impact and democratic deficit of litigation campaigns on the right. And I think we'll see much more of this in the years to come because of course, our contemporary Supreme Court has a conservative supermajority. We've already seen signs of it in terms of existing decisions on affirmative action and coming litigation campaigns on it. We, of course, have seen it with abortion too, notwithstanding the irony that Roe was supposed to be the end of the federal court's involvement with abortion and instead has become the beginning with cases like Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. We've seen it on contraception with the return of that issue to court in the DeAnda decision, and we're likely to see much more of it in other contexts too. So I was curious about a few things about this. I guess first is the story that we tell about progressives in this vein, which is to say that litigation campaigns may have this democratic deficit, but also there's a story on the left that they're not particularly effective, right? That they don't achieve the kind of change that a movement may have ultimately sought. That's a story told by Gerald Rosenberg and Michael Klarman and others. Is the parallel one we would draw in conservative litigation campaigns too? I was also fascinated by the work that the analogy to Brown was doing politically. Of course, the NAACP is often sort of held up as the ultimate incremental litigation campaign, but there are others that were, of course, at the time much of this was happening, salient too. The campaign to chip away at Roe, which of course was modeled on the campaign to chip away at Plessy. The campaign to establish a right to same-sex marriage too, which Kenji Yoshino and others have documented was sort of intended to be a reverse Brown, right, where you're establishing a right rather than undoing a precedent. And so why was Brown the go-to argument? Is it just that Brown is uniquely canonical in constitutional law? Is it that Brown was a less divisive symbol of an incremental education campaign than the attack on Roe or the fight for what would become Obergefell would be? And finally, I was interested in how this in some ways is a rereading of Brown. A lot of literature is a symbol of a court decision that is forged as part of kind of democratic or popular constitutionalism, a decision that reflects popular opinion and would not have been possible until there had been a shift in popular opinion. And I think, if anything, right, decisions like Citizens United, as Anne shows, never enjoyed that kind of popular support. And the members of this coalition were not particularly concerned whether they would or not, right? So this was not the idea that court-centered change occurs because of mobilizations outside of the court. It was court-centered change as an alternative to changes outside of the court. So I wondered too if this was a sort of rereading of Brown or a revision of what this model of social change could look like. One that again might have powerful implications at a time when conservatives are turning to the courts to advance unpopular causes, and doing so maybe without the kind of fear of backlash or counterproductive effects that we usually see. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Mary. Rick, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks. And it's so great to be back at UCI, if only virtually. And let me start with a confession that I am an Anne Southworth fanboy. It's hard to think of someone who is more judicious and generous with her comments and her own time, and wise and insightful. I come here as an election law person, not someone who studies the legal profession, but I learned so much from this book just from that perspective. So first, I'm going to briefly say what I think is great about the book, and then turn to two questions that Anne didn't address, but I think would be great for sources of future research. So this book is a tour de force for those who want to understand what's going on in the trenches among lawyers who are litigating over campaign finance. I not only study campaign finance, I occasionally litigate these cases. I litigated against Jim Bopp in a San Diego campaign finance case. And what I could say is that Anne's description, her rich description of what the lawyers are doing and how they're doing it rings very true. So if you want to see how big money built an AstroTurf campaign to go after campaign finance laws, while wrapping itself in little guy populism and analogizing itself to the Brown versus Board of Education, finding clients like Citizens United or Wisconsin Right to Life, little guys, but really being a Trojan horse for big business and also for big ideological groups, this is the book for you. So too, if you want to understand the struggle of lawyers who work for progressive reformers, how do you fight battles when you know you're going into a Supreme Court that has become increasingly hostile to the kinds of claims you want to make? How can you get victories? What does victory look like? So these are things that I think, we could think about them generally, but the examples that Anne puts together in the book and the quotes that she has, anonymized quotes, ring very true. So it feels very much like she's telling the story as a partial outsider, a partial insider experienced it. So I want to make 2 points about Anne's book, where the book didn't go, press a little bit in terms of what would be good for future research. So my first question is, why don't the anti-regulation forces in the campaign finance arena win every single case at SCOTUS? And they don't. Anne notes some of the cases they lost. The Blumen case on foreign money, where the Supreme Court unanimously doesn't even hear the case. It just says that you can completely ban foreign money in elections, despite what the court said, that the identity of the speaker doesn't matter in Citizens United. Or the Williams-Yulee case, which puts limits on campaign solicitation in the judicial context. We could add to that list at least 3 cases raising the issue of the constitutionality of corporate campaign contribution limits, or the campaign contribution ban, I should say, that the court has not taken. The court upheld such limits in FEC versus Beaumont when the court was deferential to regulation, but much has changed, and the reasoning of that case has at least partially been undermined by Citizens United. And why has the court passed up numerous opportunities to overturn the other big parts of the McCain-Feingold law, the soft money provisions? So a few possible answers. One is Roberts' incrementalism. If this is right, given that Roberts no longer controls the kind of center of the court, then I think we're going to see action heat up. So far, there's no signs of that, despite the fact that we've had this 6-3 supermajority. And many of the cases that the court took were up on mandatory appellate jurisdiction. Roberts complained about having to hear so many of these cases. So maybe it's about Roberts. Second idea is that the positions they're taking are too extreme, that there's a gap between the lawyers and the justices. That's possible. Not one justice bit on the foreign money claim in Blumen. Perhaps the court has the best of both worlds. It can effectively make campaign finance law not really work, but not take the political hit for actually striking these laws down in toto as a way of kind of having a gap between what the reality is in terms of money can get in however it wants to these days with a good lawyer, and not being told that all campaign finance laws are unconstitutional. The third possible explanation is that the lawyering is bad. Twice, Jim Bopp lost control of his cases at the Supreme Court level. Maybe the preferences of elite lawyers to bring these cases is different, although it was elite lawyer Ted Olson who was more aggressive in pushing the radical argument in Citizens United that Austin should be overturned than it was Bopp. It was interesting, as Anne noted, that some of the lawyers here, the more radical lawyers, not the Ted Olsons, but the Jim Bopps, were at least tangentially involved in efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And so there does seem to be this gap between these two fields, between these two groups of lawyers, I should say. So I'd like to know more about that, kind of the Federalist Society people, and then the Clayton Mitchells, the Jim Bopps, the iconoclasts. Okay, second set of questions. How much of what is motivating the lawyers and the conservative justices at the Supreme Court is about pure ideology, about adhering to neutral First Amendment principles? And how much is about helping causes on the right? And I ask this because if you look at a justice like Justice Thomas, we probably say he's the most libertarian among all the justices on issues of campaign finance laws. He doesn't even believe that most disclosure laws are constitutional. And yet, it's been Justice Thomas who has led the charge to loosen up the libel laws, who has led the charge to give states power to regulate the speech of social media companies by requiring platforms like Facebook to carry a politician's speech no matter what they might say. Commandeering private property to force speech is anything but libertarian. Or look at Josh Hawley, a Trumpian conservative, now calling for legislation to purportedly overturn Citizens United. Of course, we can't have legislation that overturns Citizens United, but that's a kind of signaling. This is part of Hawley going after so-called woke corporations. So all of a sudden, the right is more interested in protecting against harmful speech or promoting speech equality than they've ever been willing to recognize in their campaign finance stances. So I'd like to know how these people explain themselves. Just as I've pushed campaign finance deregulations for years to tell me how to square, their position in Citizens United with their position in Blumen on foreign money. It just seems to me that, we're at a kind of inflection point where conservatives on the court have gotten much of what they've wanted in the campaign finance area, and where they're going to go on speech in the future, I think we'll see if they're going to be applying neutral First Amendment principles. A lot of the lawyers tell Anne that that's what they care about, or this is really about helping the political right. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick. John, you get the floor.
Thanks. So first off, an honor to be able to comment on this book. I love the project. And in fact, I think as Rick introduced his comments, probably the main upshot of what I'm going to say is to recommend the book and to recommend it to a particular audience, which for me and the kind of academic sub-communities that I'm a part of would be the kind of socio-legal, new legal realist, law and society, law and social movement audience. And for someone like me who is working on some projects about lawyers and social movements, I want to explain why the book is so important and so exciting in terms of theory, methods, and motivation for doing this kind of work. So from the start of the book, Anne talks about these key cases that many of us are familiar with and the role of the changing composition of the Supreme Court. But she says, quote, "That's not the whole story. And if we really want to," now I'm not quoting, end quote, "if we really want to understand con law and changes in constitutional law and changes in society relating to law, we need to dig a little deeper. And one of the areas where we need to dig deeper is to look at the lawyers. The lawyers are a bit less obvious when you read judicial opinions. And if you're in a JD curriculum and teaching about these materials or reading law review articles or writing law review articles, or even in the interdisciplinary literature. So, here we find that these lawyers are playing these very crucial roles, brokering between a movement where you have grassroots and nonprofits and funders, and a legal field where Anne describes these lawyers as entrepreneurial lawyers, developing creative new legal theories and then sort of legitimating and advancing those theories with the judiciary. And the lawyers are a sort of hidden part of our story. And if we didn't have this qualitative work, I think we would end up with a really distorted understanding of these issues. Something I really admire about the book is that we're looking at both sides. We have the challengers and the reformers, as they're termed in the book. And so we start with the cases, and then she's looking deeper into the briefs, and then we're actually getting to these lawyers on both sides and finding out what motivates them. And I think this behind the scenes story is all the more important in movements like this that have operated somewhat quietly, that we're dealing with issues of dark money and a movement that is operating largely by trying to change the composition of the judiciary and then talk to that judiciary, as opposed to some louder activities that movements often involve in, like public education and protest, and the realm of electoral politics being downplayed a bit here. And there's a related point I want to emphasize, although I think Mary and Rick have covered this a bit, that I appreciate the book's effort to take these lawyers seriously, to give a fair, nuanced, and non-polarized account of them, because it's all too easy to sort of, depending on your political persuasion, to sort of put them in one bucket or another and sort of stereotype them and miss out on these deeper stories. One key issue that I wanted to leave off with and ask some questions about has to do with the accountability theories that these lawyers have. And we have this literature asking whether lawyers in social movements have always been really representative of the constituencies that are most affected. There's a lot of examples where it seems like they're not. There's questions about the ethics of cause lawyering. I was teaching about cause lawyering this week, and a student gave me a very nice quote. He said, I'll paraphrase at least, that it seems like cause lawyers are the heroes of the legal profession, but they're the lawyers who seem to reject the lawyer role. So there's an interesting kind of paradox. We spent the whole semester studying these kind of duties and obligations of lawyers to clients, and then it seems like the heroes of the profession are folks that are a lot less focused on clients. And as Anne says, maybe she hasn't found lawyers necessarily violating some of these ethical duties, but I do think that my student and scholars of cause lawyering who've talked about this particular version of the lawyer role are right, and that part of what they're identifying that Anne's book helped me think about is that as you move away from a client-centered vision of accountability, you lose this kind of tether of accountability, that the client in a conventional client-centered advocacy context gives you someone that you can actually talk to, whereas what we see here through empirical qualitative work is the messy world of a constituency that consists of a loose coalition, quote, enormous, diffuse, and complex population, with internal conflicts and, you know, power inequities. So how does the lawyer sort of maintain that sense that they're socialized to internalize generally that you're here to, you know, to serve others and to you know, to ideally maintain this duty to the public interest, but also you know, not just in your own formulation, to people that are most affected. And it does seem, I wanted to sort of ask about what you learn from these advocates. There's a great analysis of how they think about accountability, but I'm hoping there might be some lessons from these lawyers, some innovations in how they think about this issue, because they face this challenge of representing a movement like this. And I do walk away with some of the skepticism that the reformers group carries here, which is that they look at the conservative lawyers that want to deregulate campaign finance and say, you know, it seems like maybe they've been co-opted by their donors. Maybe this isn't even very consistent with some strands of conservative thought. And, you know, they've somehow sold this, to quote Bopp, as, quote, the little guy's right to participate in politics. But it really doesn't seem like it's about the little guy. And I love that you have this empirical uncertainty when you talk about this issue, and that you say that, you know, you actually sort of don't have a clear message from the conservatives here saying, you know, whether this is consistent with some of their other views and other goals. And I think there's a methodological aspect to this question. This is my last point. Through confidential interviews, you get this transparency from respondents often, but you also get people trying to tell their story the way that they want it to be told. And someone who's writing a book, that's an exciting opportunity to have your story told. So I'm curious the ways in which you think they might have been holding back, or more generally, what did they have to say about accountability, or what do you take from this that might be useful as advice for lawyers in social movements? Thank you.
Thank you, John. Brian?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this as I listen to the discussion, and the thing I want to say is that this is an instant classic, and really, it is a marvelous book, and a marvelous book on the legal profession, exploring the conflicts in the profession, how, if at all, legal ethics relates to the people bringing these campaigns. Entrepreneurialism that characterizes the profession. And I think this is the first time I really thought about technology, that you have this society as a production machine that can construct legal arguments in an instant and live them all in the space of an instant. And of course, a well-funded, you know, liberal machine could do the same thing, but it's probably not as well-funded and as well organized. So the title is Big Money Unleashed, and as a legal profession book, I read it in part as lawyers inventing arguments through this incredible machine, you know, dominated by the Federalist Society. So they're inventing them, they're selling them, and there are many ways that you could have the reforms that ended up, or the deregulation that ended up, but you get a particular way so that the winners are the billionaires. Suddenly, holes that were burning in their pockets are now free to buy as much influence as they like. But the winners are also elite lawyers, and elite lawyers in the domain that they control, the court. So there's almost no mention of legislatures by anybody in this book. There may be 3 or 4, it seems like, but mostly it's all about a battle in the courts, and the good guys lost and the bad guys won. And but I think it's not just because of the court, it's because we live in a billionaires world, and this was bound to happen some way. So the key agent in all of this is Mitch McConnell. And that's a wonderfully fascinating story. It looks like he's just the right man in the right place in Kentucky. He sees that there's a lot of money around where people would like to give to him. And he starts looking around and he finds this, potential federal society here and there, and he succeeds. And he's like the catalyst. He's like Ed Meese and others in your first book. He's just the right person at the right instant. And what he succeeds in doing is actually generating legal arguments so that the billionaires, by law, they like working with these elite lawyers who are giving them exactly what they want. So I think it's, in my sociology of law, and not everybody loves this, lawyers and the law follow power, and they're going to follow it one way or the other. And there are lawyer brokers who invent arguments and sell things to the powerful. And I think I can make this point because I hadn't realized how much this book is the perfect sequel to your first book. Because the first book, at the end, you have a reluctant Reagan administration. I have no confidence in law. And at the end, they've legalized their own neoliberal agenda, deregulation. They've bought law, and they've also bought the hierarchies of law. So the big firms win. They're now more conservative. They're more conservative public interest lawyers. They're more conservative academics, almost which existed, until the Reagan administration, until the transformation that took place. And what they succeed in doing is they demonize the state. That's what neoliberalism is. And this book shows how building on that demonization of the state's what I can spin, the state's telling this, it goes the next step. You create billionaires from the first book, out of the neoliberalism that took place. And now you've succeeded in legalizing, constitutionalizing, and billionaires the ability to use their money for however they like in campaigns, pretty much. There are lots of legal nuances, and I'm a person on those. But at the end of the day, billions. And part of what hasn't been said is that the Democrats have fully taken advantage of this as well. It looks like they're quite happy with this result. They have their billionaires who they like, and the Republicans have their they like. So at the end of the day, we have a perfect government for billionaires and elite lawyers. And they keep in check, dangerous populist lawyers who are not at the head of keep the decisions being made in the courts. And so when we have elections, the elections are about who will the next judges be. So it's just a comment. My question is, does that fit at all your reading of continuities between the two books? And
You were not alone in thinking those two books were so perfectly orchestrated. Like, I remember thinking of it when we did the workshop and reading the final product. I really think the arc between the two books is so striking, both in terms of the actors, the organization, and John's point about the empirics versus the others. I wasn't going to talk, and I know I promised you I would just go straight, allow you the floor for things and go straight to the floor. But I have one question and one arc of the book that I actually think tacks on to one of Mary's questions, but might be helpful for you to flesh out a little bit when you're giving your response comments, because I think it's, to me, one of the most theoretically interesting parts of the book that blend this book with the last book, which is this idea of, Mary asked the question about what brought these actors together. Was it just the fact that they had co-joint interests, or was it money, right? Like, the big idea is that this is capital, and we have our billionaires, you have yours, and we build these parallel structures. And that seems to be a very compelling story. But to me, what was striking was the kinds of solidarities across actor groups that you would not have imagined, these unlikely solidarities, as you call them, across both this book and I think it's a signature of like how thoughtful your research is that it's both incredibly detailed about the ways in which these solidarities work within each group, but you're very candid about the ways in which folks that you would not imagine sitting together are actually sharing resources when strategic for the legal movement. This is why it's such a brilliant legal profession book, right? Because it's reminding us that lawyers, when strategic, can sit with unlikely allies to build the movements that they want. Money might be fueling it, but part of it is also that the role of the lawyer is in moving with the movement rather than sort of being restrictive to it. So I wanted to highlight that because it's the thing I loved most about your first book. It's a thing that I use a lot when I use that sort of book in terms of other theories. And to me, that the ways in which your story about campaign finance and the lawyer's role in it sat alongside that theory in that first book about unlikely allies was just really generative as an idea to think about legal movements and social movements more generally. So I just wanted to put a plug for that piece of thinking, because I do think that's a Southworth signature and I've learned so much from it, but I also think this book does it so well. And I just wanted to voice that. Over to you, Anne. You get the floor.
So I am just kind of overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude for these amazing comments from wonderful scholars and friends. I am just daunted. The comments are so rich that I can't begin to do justice to responding to them. I'm just going to touch a few of them, and you know, they all fit, I think, under a general heading of this story won't sit still, just as the story of the last book didn't sit still. It's a kind of moving picture. And so all of these comments, I think, in some ways relate to that. Mary asked a lot of good questions, including this question about the role money played in holding this effort together. I think that was definitely part of it. She points to the role of the frames and ideology, and I think those two played important roles. And I love the point about why the NAACP was the model used to describe this effort and the incremental litigation campaign. I think she's absolutely right that a different organization, a different campaign could have been the model, but obviously the effort to desegregate was one that has a sort of unifying, there's a unifying approval of that campaign in a way that makes it a very attractive model for this one. Rick, your suggestions are fabulous, and you are already sending me on my way to a few more research projects. I think the question of the ways in which there are divisions within the actors in the story I tell, and how the populist elements seem to be in conflict in a way today that was not true even just a few years ago when I was doing the interviews for this project. It's just totally fascinating. I would love to be the fly on the wall at some of the meetings that are taking place now within the Federalist Society, for example, and what, as complex as the conservative legal movement was at the time I wrote my first book, it's taken on a whole new shape, a whole new set of dynamics over the past 10 years and certainly over the last 5. So there's so much to explore there. John, your comments are also just so generative for me. By the way, I'm going to give a plug for some of your work on these issues of accountability, thinking about the lawyer's roles in campaigns. And I agree that there's a lot to explore here and to compare across different kinds of campaigns and the dynamics within them. I loved your point about methods, and you're absolutely right that the relying on interviews to get trustworthy windows into how people are actually thinking about their roles and aspirations and motivations is always a tricky business. And so I I think that the reader needs to take what I lay out for them with a grain of salt, just as I did in trying to make sense of what these lawyers had to say. BG, as usual, you've given a kind of masterclass on how to make sense of any story in American politics and economy, and connect it to important to stories about the legal profession and hierarchies within the legal profession. And my conversations with you about this project over the years certainly have influenced my take on what's happening here. And I think there's a great deal to the story you're telling about how to think about the connection between the profession and these dynamics. I also agree with you about the continuities between the books. The big picture is that this is a story that won't sit still. And even rereading the book over the last day just to prepare for this event, I realized that things are in flux in a way that means that that there's more research to be done to understand what's happening. Sweta, these are wonderful comments. Thank you so much. And I agree with you about the unlikely allies, and the question of how groups find ways to cooperate strategically is a really important question. Lawyers often can play that role, but there are differences in their abilities to do so, and differences in different types of groups' ability to do so. And you've given me so much to think about there. I just want to, I know this isn't the time, not the right occasion for me to express my thanks to all of the hundreds of people to whom I'm indebted for help with this book, but I did want to take the chance just to offer a few notes of thanks. First, I'm super indebted to the lawyers who permitted me to interview them for this project. They took time from busy lives to provide behind the scenes information and perspectives on the history of this litigation campaign, strategic considerations, and what they understood to be the stakes of this battle over regulating money in politics. I'm so grateful to the many scholars at UCI and elsewhere, some of whom are on this call, who participated in workshops and conferences at which I presented pieces of this manuscript. I've tried really hard to make good use of your advice, but I'm sure I've fallen short in many respects. I'm also indebted to the editors and staff at the University of Chicago Press, to our amazing UCI Law librarians who helped me find sources, sometimes very obscure ones, and to my excellent research assistants. And of course, I'm grateful to all of those attending today's book launch. I really do look forward to future conversations with you and others about the topics addressed in this book. And one more note, a plug for Mary Ziegler's fantastic book on a topic that's very much related to mine. It's called Dollars for Life, the Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment. And it came out in 2022 from the Yale University Press. Thank you, thank you.
You know, one of the best pieces of advice I got when I did my book launch was that this was a chance to start conversations. We all think of writing books as the end of a conversation, but it's often just putting something out in the world that offers other folks chances to be in engagement with you. And so thank you for bringing your book here. Thank you for actually offering us a chance to celebrate it. Congratulations.
Thank you so very much for coming. And please, I look forward to future conversations with all of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for writing this book for us, Anne. It's a big public service.
Thank you all, and thank you, Anne.